Back in 2015, a little Brazilian indie game called Toren released. I played it, I loved it, but the clunky little action-adventure was swiftly dwarfed by other indie games like Life is Strange. It garnered a handful of articles at the time, but nothing much since. I find this to be a major oversight on part of the games journalism community because Toren does a lot to push how games express their narrative forward. It enshrouds its story with a variety of themes in a manner resembling the language of film rather than the current common language of games. Which is not to say the story is told through endless lines of dialogue and cutscenes, but instead through visual elements, metaphors, and narrative themes. Before writing this episode, I tried to find any in-depth analysis of Toren I could read or watch, and well, I couldn't find much that surpassed its outer layer of narrative. Toren isn't really about a moon princess slaying a dragon on top of a tower. It's about the cycle and nature of life, emphasizing the woman's role and perspective on it. While some outlets caught on to the feminine coming of age, there's also a lot that no one has dove into yet. Nothing that I could find, at least. So I'm going to try and do my best to piece together what I can make of this unassuming indie adventure. Of course, before I can discuss that, I may as well address the elephant of gameplay in the room. Spoilers abound from here on out. Toren is clunky as fudge is chunky. Enemy hitboxes are inaccurate and inconsistent. The Moonchild leaps as if she's, well, on the moon. The best way to dodge these bug critters is to keep jumping awkwardly past them. It should go without saying, but if you're anticipating AAA polish, you're going to be disappointed. This is a small developer in Brazil working on their first major game release, and at first blush they seem to have bitten off more than they could chew. So why would a pretentious guy like me forgive a game like Toren of its faults? Well, the game is more about puzzles and navigation than it is about action. It may be no brain bender like Portal, but you're going to be spending the majority of your time exploring the environment and developing new ways of interacting with the world. The awkward kinesthetics, such as the floaty feeling you get when leaping, do not interfere with the game's intended focus. It's the dream sequences that house some of the most interesting gameplay or introduce new mechanics. One of the first things you stumble across in the game is a lone deer hanging around minding its own business. A quick sprint away lies a blood-stained altar. After falling into a meditative dream world where the princess learns how to lead a deer and use it for a sacrifice, the option to reflect this same task outside of the dream is made available. This ritual will unlock a new ability to the player, rewarding them for implementing what they learned in the dream. Within that same dream, the player must stab their blade into the ground to remain steadfast against howling winds. This is preparation for a conflict with the dragon, whose wings send powerful gusts that batter and push the player backward. Step by step throughout Toren, the player will uncover more of these interactions and mechanics, the majority of which are tied to a single action button. Such a simplified interface keeps the player thinking more on the world they're interacting with rather than the logistics of exerting their influence. Pushing or pulling blocks, lighting torches, even slashing at a dragon, all mapped to a single button. Again, liberating the mind from navigating their fingers around the controller to instead take in the world and become aware of what actions are available. Do these actions lack depth? Perhaps, but in a 3-hour game, efforts to dig deeper into these mechanics would just overcomplicate things. As it is, each new action, or verb, delivered so closely together in a shorter game establishes a steady pacing of new, making each portion of the game snappy. This may sound like damning with faint praise, but the gameplay is sufficiently competent and serves its intended purpose. A smaller team needs a smaller scope, and Sword Tales fortunately knew what elements of the game to focus on. The end result is a 3-hour indie game that's pretty fun to play. It might otherwise be a bit forgettable were it not for everything else that just makes it work. But before I discuss all of that, when people describe games as being cinematic, they are usually referring to the story being delivered in cutscenes imitating the Hollywood style, or throwing the player into crazy first-person blockbuster action set pieces. This is a simplified perception of what cinema is, however. When I compare Toren to films, I don't mean that it looks like how a film is directed. Instead, I am talking about how the underlying themes are represented through characters or visual elements within the film. Let's take a look at the film Rear Window, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. On the surface, it's little more than a paranoid thriller about whether or not the neighbor murdered his wife. On a much deeper level, Hitchcock crafted a film about human relationships, community, and isolation. Consider how, despite living in this small little community, every neighbor is isolated from one another. The dancer goes on about her day oblivious to the goings-on outside. No one pays a single mind to Miss Lonely Hearts. The pianist in the studio holds a party where none of the neighbors take part. This isolation is visually represented through the use of windows into each apartment, framing their personal lives as if the people within are trapped in a box. All of these boxes are beside each other, but no one is truly together. A concept that plays into the relationship of L.B. Jeffries keeping his girlfriend Lisa at a distance throughout the movie. That is the language of film. While games certainly have their own language, such as those I observed in my early video on tutorials, and while I certainly don't want games to try and be film, I do believe there are elements of film that games can grasp onto and reinterpret for their own unique form of storytelling. I don't know if developer Sword Tales did so intentionally with Toren, but they're one of the few games I've played to explore themes in a manner so similar. I'm going to start on a macro scale here, and to do so I need to begin with the end credits to Toren and the prelude comic on the game's website. Each share the same artwork telling a story of man's war-torn progress through the ages. Wisdom and knowledge are turned into death and destruction, until at last a tower is built in an effort to reach the heavens and save mankind. This is what brings the current tower to creation, but the end credits suggest that this is a constantly repeating cycle. Once the credits are over and a new world is suggested to have begun yet again, the Moonchild awakens once more at the bottom of the tower and we return to the title screen. In other words, no matter how many millennia pass, mankind will find themselves right back where they started. The entire human race gets pushed to the brink of extinction only to return to zero. Death and rebirth. Overseeing it all is the moon, or at least the artwork emphasizes the moon. The comic notes that the sun and moon trade places overseeing the passing of time, and this will be important later down the line. For now, let's just focus on just the moon, seeing as our protagonist is the Moonchild. We begin on top of the tower, which is built around a tree. If you read the comic, humanity is born from a tree. However, the tree seems unable to grow as a dragon uses its breath and touch to cause decay throughout the tower. Nothing is able to survive it, save for the Moonchild deflecting it with her blade. What the player is likely unaware of is the surface level conflict being established. The dragon, which shall be a metaphor for death, is preventing this tree from beginning life again. There is a male warrior lying defeated upon the ground that, again, we'll get to later. The Moonchild's mission, then, is to defeat the dragon, to defeat death, and allow humanity to be reborn. Doesn't work. The dragon knocks the sword from the Moonchild's grasp and, without it, she, too, decays. But all is not lost. The Moonchild is reborn at the base of the tower in a puddle of blood? Huh. So here's where my theory really begins. As I said, the basic story is surface level stuff. Thanks to the comic and credits, we know that the tree is what bore the fruits of humanity. The tower is built around a tree, and as you progress through the game, you help it to grow. As such, we can easily construe that the objective is to defeat the dragon with a venomous touch and allow humanity to be reborn. Decay, war-torn humanity, death, rebirth. It's pretty clear we're talking about life cycles here. Everything is a symbol or abstraction of life or death. The dragon represents death. So does that make the Moonchild life? Well, not quite, but it is her perspective we'll be focusing on, and we begin with a new Moonchild. A new birth. A new cycle. As you progress through the game, the Moonchild ages and matures. She begins as an infant and swiftly becomes a child garbed in red. As she becomes older, her red dress is replaced with a white one, a dress that more resembles a wedding gown of sorts. Traditionally, a wedding gown is white in order to represent sexual purity. In many cultures, women were expected to be virgins when they married. Now let's consider that whole cycles concept again. Consider the lunar cycle, and how a complete cycle through each phase takes about a month. You know where I'm going with this, right? Well, just in case you don't, each time the child wakes from a dream and finds she has matured, she is once again in a puddle of blood. Now, obviously, when she is a baby, the Moonchild wouldn't be menstruating or anything of the sort, but babies also aren't born squeaky clean. Needless to say, when a woman's body reaches biological maturity, she is capable of giving birth to new life. Now the story of Toren is more than a broad metaphor for the cycle of life and death. We are now specifically viewing the growth of a child to a woman through the journey of the Moon Princess. In addition, we now see that the only thing that can stop the dragon, who represents death and decay, is a woman, the gender capable of giving birth to new life. Without woman, mankind has no new beginning. But, without man, woman would also fade away, which is where Salador, the Sun Warrior, comes in. According to the poems told by the old wizard, Salador climbed the tower to defeat the dragon, gazing longingly at the moon as if in love. However, Salador came to realize that he and the dragon would be doomed to fight forever. In other words, mankind cannot outrun death. But what I really want to focus on is the final battle of the game. God, this gets me so fired up every time. In order to defeat the dragon, Salador and the Moonchild must work together. When the dragon unleashes the decay, the Moonchild must guard Salador and use her sword to block the dragon's power. When the dragon sends powerful gusts of wind at the pair, the Moonchild must hide behind Salador, whose tall shield keeps the wind at bay. Sun, moon, sun, moon, sun, moon. It's a cycle. It's a partnership. It is a courtship necessary for life to continue on this earth. Think about it. The Moonchild is now dressed as if in wedding garb. She works together with Salador, the warrior of the sun, in order to defeat death. Courtship, marriage, mating. And once the dragon has been defeated, once death has been conquered, the Moonchild returns to being a baby. In other words, the cycle resets, a new woman is born, and the journey, the struggle, will begin again. That is what Toren is about, and that is why I love it. At first blush, it seems like some obtuse art student's project, but so many of the pieces fit neatly together to tell a cohesive story about something simple, the cycle of life as explored through a woman's experience within it. Now, there are more things going on, of course. Each time the Moon Princess dies, a statue of her old self is left behind. You are, in fact, forced to die at one point, with your solidified corpse acting as a bridge onwards. In many of the sequences that the dragon can kill you, your old body can serve as beneficial cover to you. Consider once again the comic in the game's end credits. As uncomfortable a truth as it is, progress is often made through the sacrifice of those that have come before. Sacrificing the deer, twice, also lends itself to this concept, as within the dream it opens the path forward, and from without the dream, you obtain a beneficial upgrade. So while the game is about conquering death, it is also making note of the necessity of sacrifice to move forward. Of course, this is all my theory, and there are plenty of elements I haven't completely pieced together yet. Within one of the dreams, the player falls into water. In every direction there are statues of young girls curled up in a fetal position. Is this symbolic of a fetus within a mother's uterus peacefully sleeping in amniotic fluid? I don't know. The downside of the game being so obtuse is that there's a lot of elements that could either be there for aesthetic value or serve a purpose I haven't yet figured out. It also adds in doubt to my own reading of the narrative that perhaps I may be reading too much into it. But in terms of what I've presented here, I don't think so. I think Toren is very much a game that uses visual elements and mythological nature to tell an epic tale representing life, death, and a woman's space in it. I understand that, in a lot of ways, this could come off as reductionist. You could read it as claiming a woman's purpose in life is to have babies, or you could read it negatively as it is heteronormative. Keep in mind, however, that the story itself is very simplified. If the game is truly asserting that woman's role is little more than having babies, then man's role is to kill one another. At the end of the day, I don't think Toren is making any such broad claims. I think it is taking simple concepts and telling them in a fashion through video games that just wouldn't be the same as through a short film or short story. This is especially true of the final conflict, which pulls the player directly into its themes by turning the cycle of day and night into gameplay. Now I'm excited to see what Sword Tales puts together next. I can only hope that they'll get a lot more exposure as time marches on. This is a game that a lot more game designers, professional, independent, and student need to be studying. Because Toren isn't trying to evolve game's narrative in a superficial manner. This isn't about cutscenes or dialogue or anything like that. It's about the game itself and how those elements come together without relying on that other stuff. And that's what makes Toren special.
tower. The moon and sun divided, the hangman smiles. Lovers in the tower. The